It's good to be here. It's good to be here worshiping our God together. Each year, the elders at the beginning of the year kind of give me a list of things to talk about in the coming year. And one of the things they've asked me to talk about this year are lessons from women in the Bible. And I've been thinking about that all year, about how I was going to handle that. The fact of the matter is that there are hundreds and hundreds of lessons that can be derived from stories in the Bible about women, because women figure very prominently in many of the stories of the Bible and are in the subtext of nearly all of the stories in the Bible and somehow involved in them. And in each case, there are lessons to be derived from that, lessons about godliness and faithfulness, and also about sin and mistakes. And in this case, I'm primarily going to focus in the coming lessons. I'll preach 3 or 4 lessons on this subject, but I'll primarily focus on godly women, on women who are good examples. It is, of course, something that is for some people a sore point in our world, in our culture, about how women are handled in the Bible, because we live in a culture and a day and time in which people have the philosophy, the view that women should more or less be men. They should be able to act like and perform the functions that men perform and do the things that men do, and that the whole idea, the whole roles of gender in our society are they're so in flux, in a state of flux. And so naturally the Bible and the way that women are portrayed in the Bible does not coincide with, does not mesh up or match up to a lot of these views that are current in our society today. And so they take issue with the Bible. And of course, it's not the only thing that people in a world and worldly people take issue with in the Bible. It's one of the things they do. And I would say that most of that has to do with, number one, a misunderstanding or misapprehension of what the Bible actually says about women, and number two, just a lot of worldly and ungodly and not correct views about the subject. And these lessons are not really about that. They're not about trying to answer the objection that women are not dealt with correctly in the Bible. That's not what these lessons are about. But, you could say that in defense of the way that women are treated in the Bible, that in terms of what the world thought of women at the time the Bible was written, the Bible and the way that women are respected and highly regarded was revolutionary, really. Certainly the way that Jesus treated women and held women in regard is unprecedented in the ancient world. It doesn't really matter to people in this day and time because, as I say, their views on the subject are so in contrast with God's perception of what we're about. It doesn't really matter that women were treated quite differently in the Bible than they were in the world at large. But perhaps the main point that I would make in that regard is what I am going to talk about this morning, and that is values. The values of the world are not the values of God. The values of the world are not the values of the Bible. You see, in the world, what matters is status, power, authority. And if you don't have authority or power or status, then you are not important and you are disrespected. If you're not allowed to have authority, if you're not allowed to have power, then you are being slighted And that's the way the world looks at things. And in that regard, women have often been slighted and disrespected because they've been allowed to have positions of authority or power or status. But God doesn't care about those things. God does not care about human power or authority or status. And the best illustration of that point is that when God came into the world and became a man, he had no power or authority or status. Did not seek it. And he allowed himself to be disrespected and abused and mistreated. And he chose to serve rather than to snatch away the glory of this world by exerting physical power, domination over others. You see, the Savior that I follow, the Master that I answer to, died for me on the cross. If you want to know what the Bible has to say about human perceptions of who is dignified and who is to be respected and who is to be given status and power and authority, then I tell you to look to the cross, because it turns all human perceptions of those things on its head. My Master says, "He who would be greatest in the kingdom of heaven shall be a servant." Which brings me to the subject at hand. The Bible talks about women a lot, and the women that it holds up as examples to be followed, to be admired, are women who served, are women who acted in the best interest of others and sacrificed their own time, their own resources to help others. These are the people that are held up as admirable, the ones who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven are those who serve. And so this morning I want to talk about acts of kindness, because what we learn in the Bible is that, yes, women didn't have status, they didn't have power or authority for the most part. There are a few exceptions to that. And yet, they were great. And great in small deeds that the world may not appreciate, but God does. And one of the things that the Bible teaches us, and not just women, a lot of times when we handle the subject of women in the Bible, the implication is that these lessons are for women, but they're not. They're for all of us. The women in the Bible are no more to be examples just for women as men are just to be examples for men. These are godly women. In the end, there is neither male nor female. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither Greek nor Jew. It's people who have a heart that is devoted to God, that God lifts up, that God appreciates, that God rewards. And so these lessons are for all of us, these lessons of godly women. But one of the things that we're shown is that because they were in positions where they didn't have a lot of power, didn't have a lot of status, women could do something. They could serve, and they did. And they served through acts of kindness. And they are lauded for it and rewarded by God for it. And so I just want to talk about for a few moments, use some examples of godly women in the Bible who committed acts of kindness, and what lessons we can learn from that. And the first one I want to look at has to do with Rebekah. And it's here in Genesis chapter 24. in verse 37 that Abraham sent one of his servants back to the home country to find a wife for his son Isaac. And this guy shows up after a long journey with his camels, and he comes to a well, and he doesn't know what woman to pick for his master's son's wife, but he prays. He prays to God, and he says, Lord, help me out here. If you will, I'll ask these girls who are at the well, I'll ask them for a glass of water, and if any one of them says, I'll water your camels too, I'll know that that's the one. And so he comes, and he approaches the well, and the servant said to one of the young ladies, please give me some water from your jar, because the girls would go and they would draw water for the family and for the animals, and that was a chore that the women would do, that the girls would do. And so he approached one and said, can I have a drink of water? Will you draw some water out of the well? And Rebekah was there, and she said in verse 18, drink, my lord. And she quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink, which was a small act of kindness. But then she said this, after she had given him a drink. She said, I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink. It's interesting. Sometimes details are overlooked in stories. We're told this guy had 10 camels. And usually you would think, well, what difference does it make whether how many camels he had? Well, I looked it up. And after a journey, one camel can drink 30 gallons of water in 15 minutes. 10 camels, 300 gallons of water. 8.5 pounds or so, 8.8 pounds per gallon. It's over a ton of water. Something like 2,500 pounds. So not a small act of kindness, but a pretty impressive one, really. Now, why did Rebekah do that? Well, this guy had prayed. He prayed and he said, Lord, you've made a promise to your servant Abraham. And by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. He says, if one of these young ladies will water my camels, that is how you will show kindness to my master. The kindness of God to Abraham. The mercy of God to Abraham. The blessing of God to Abraham was accomplished through the kindness of Rebekah. You see, Rebekah didn't know what God's plan was. She had no concept of the importance of what she was doing, that she was answering a prayer to God about the most consequential program of God saving the world. The blessing to Abraham, the lineage of Abraham, the seed of Abraham, by which you and I are blessed through Jesus Christ. She had no concept that she was participating in the scheme of redemption. No, she was acting out of kindness. And she had no expectation that any reward would accrue to that. She didn't do it because she thought she'd get paid for it. She didn't do it because she thought God would reward her for it. Oh, then maybe she had some concept of living a godly life or a kind life, and maybe God would return that. But in this particular instance, in this moment, the stranger comes up, asks for a glass of water. You think she's stuck? Well, I think I need to water this guy's camels because I will get X, Y, or Z. No. No. She was just acting out of kindness. That's all she was doing. Pretty substantial act of kindness. Drawing that pail after pail of water to satisfy the thirst of those camels. You see, that's the lesson. That's the example that we all need to follow, that she became the mother of Israel. I mean, literally the mother of Israel, because her child, Jacob, is Israel. In answer to God's prayer, in answer to the prayer the servant prayed, she became the mother of Israel because she performed an act of kindness. And so that, that's the lesson. We think of accomplishments for God as being great deeds. It's just watering somebody's camels. And if that's true, and it is true, then the deeds that women perform, acts of kindness, women in the church, and men in the church, all of us, deeds of kindness that we perform, you don't think they matter? That this isn't of supreme interest to God? Of supreme value to God? Of course they are. That's the lesson from Rebekah. Now we have Ruth, of course, and she's a great example of the same kind of thing. Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, were widowed, and they had to travel back to Israel without anything, destitute as they were, without any kind of support, means of support. And Ruth, in order to support her and her mother-in-law, voluntarily, she comes back with her and she goes out in the fields and she gleans. And gleaning is going after the harvesters and picking up what they drop. Think about something that's demeaning in the eyes of the world. You're just a scrounger, You're just scrounging after the leavings, the leftovers. And that's what Ruth was doing day after day. She was gathering grain. And of course, we know the story of Boaz sees her doing this and knows that she's taking care of her mother-in-law and admires her for that. And so he treats her with some respect and dignity and kindness and provides some lunch for her. And so that day, Ruth gathers all day gleaning, and she beats out the grains so that they're separated, and she brings them home, and she has some food left over from her lunch. And she gives that to her mother-in-law. So she worked all day. She had some lunch. She had some leftovers from lunch, but instead of eating her leftovers, she gives that to her mother-in-law. And she's doing this, day after day. She's working in the fields, gleaning, and not the kind of thing that a lot of people would look at and say, well, that's important. That's dignified. Or what status she has. What a great example of somebody I want to be. I want to be somebody who's basically essentially just, cleaning up after other people and scrounging about and getting by. How's the world, that kind of thing? I suppose people would say, well, that's being disrespectful to her. Well, somebody saw what Ruth was doing and admired it. Boaz saw it. God saw it. And of course, later on, when she brings this food that she saved back to Naomi, and I just think that moment when she brings that grain in and sets it down, and she brings the food in and sets it down, that quiet little moment between Ruth and Naomi, and how Naomi's spirits were lifted up. She gets to eat, probably thing to eat all day, and the quiet little words that they share, and Ruth says, this fellow has been kind to me and has allowed me to glean in his field without troubling me, and has provided this little meal. And Naomi sees that. Just the spirits that are lifted up by that moment, that little thing. Those moments that we have between us, when we help each other out. It's so powerful, so meaningful. And as I said, later, at the direction or instruction of Naomi, goes and presents herself basically to Boaz as an opportunity to become his woman or to marry him or what have you. And a lot of people in the world would look at that and say, oh, that's disgusting, that's so demeaning, that she has to do that. She has to look to a man for support or something like that. And, that's the way the world looks at things, through the lens of pride and status, and it's not the way Boaz took it, or even Ruth took it. Boaz was impressed. He says, these are acts of kindness that you are performing. Great acts of kindness. To me, to your mother-in-law. And so, we need to understand that these acts of kindness, of putting the interests of others above ourselves, those are the things that are admirable. Those are the things that are beautiful. Those are the things that we should appreciate. And once again, Ruth had no idea that she was participating in God's plan in any way, shape, or form. Had no concept of that. And she had zero expectation. Going back to Israel with her mother-in-law, gleaning in the fields. What was that going to lead to? How was that going to work out in her favor? All she was doing was being kind to a person she loved. That's all she was doing. And she became the great-grandmother of King David. And the ancestor of Jesus. Because she was being kind. 1 Kings chapter 17, we read the story about the widow of Zarephath, and Elijah, after a couple of years of, he is told by God to go to Sidon and Zarephath, and there will be a woman there, and he goes to this town, and he sees this woman, and he says, can you give me some water to drink? Just give me a drink of water. And she's going off to get the drink of water, which, a stranger comes and asks for water, and she bothers to actually go and get the water. And he stops her and he says, also bring me some food. And you know the story, how it goes. She says, well, we don't have any food. We have just barely enough here for one meal, and we're going to eat that. And then I guess we're going to starve to death. And Elijah says, well, why don't you make that cake for me, and it'll be okay. Which is an amazing, remarkable thing that the woman does that. It's a whole story all itself. But just this first little moment when he asks for a jar of water, a glass of water, and she goes to get that water, that's how that starts. Just a cup of cold water. It's amazing, isn't it? And again, you had no expectation of being a participant in God's plan. One of the women to whom Jesus in his teaching refers to. He refers to this woman She had no concept that she would play a role in the gospel of salvation for the world. She was just doing a little small act of kindness. That's all she was doing. And through that, she was delivered. Through the miracle that Elijah performed, she survived, her and her son, through the rest of the famine. And, that's the way that works. You don't have any idea what God can do with your little acts of kindness. And then here in John 12, verse 3, we read the story about Mary. Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. She takes this little jar of perfume, very expensive, by the way, very, very expensive jar of perfume, and she anoints Jesus. And you know the story, how the disciples take issue with it, that there's a lot of money to spend all at once to just, anoint somebody in the perfume and so forth. And Jesus rebukes them, and he says, why do you trouble this woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. That's how it's translated in some translations. A good work, a beautiful thing, a beautiful thing. How much it should mean to us that we should have the opportunity to do something that Jesus would look at and say, that is a beautiful thing. Now, the world would look at it and say, make it a woman, anoint your feet, waste all her money on your feet, and wipe it dignified. How respectful to women. That's the way the world would look at that. Well, we have to learn, brethren. We have to learn to look at things the way that our God looks at things. That what matters, what is beautiful, what is lovely, what is good, are these acts of kindness and of love. They are so powerful. They are so meaningful. And again, she had no concept the role that she was playing in this story as it was unfolding, had no expectation that she would get some kind of great reward for her sacrifice. She was simply doing something out of love, an act of kindness. And now she's remembered the world over. As Jesus himself says, she will be remembered for what she has done, to prepare him for his burial, to be a participant in that most wonderful, wonderful act of God's grace and salvation. And finally, the example of Tabitha or Dorcas in the New Testament, Acts chapter 9, the story of how this woman, member of the church, and she died. And the brethren found out that Peter was nearby, and so they sent word to him about this, because maybe he can do something about that. A remarkable act of faith in itself, to think that Peter could do something about this woman who had died. And it describes this woman here in Acts chapter 9 and verse 36. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means gazelle. And that's the actual translation. I know a lot of times it says Dorcas, but that's no translation at all. That's just the Greek word that means gazelle. And so I went ahead and I translated it for you. Her name was Tabitha, but it meant gazelle. She was full of good works and acts of charity, which she did continually. What a description. It's important to be a disciple, and she was. But to be a disciple of Jesus means to be somebody who is full of good works and acts of charity, and she was. And she was appreciated and admired and respected in the church, maybe not in the world. Maybe the world would look at that woman and say, well, you need to become the leader of the church in order to be considered respectable and dignified, or you need to assert your authority and be empowered as a woman. Well, she was empowered. The power of God to do the most important things of all, the things that matter most of all. While we're in this world, while we live in this world of struggle and strife, where people are proud and vain and care about things that don't matter to God at all. Why are we in this world? To struggle against those attitudes, those thoughts of self-exaltation. And instead, follow the example of Jesus Christ and be a disciple and perform acts and works of love and kindness and charity. Do so continually, because he who is least shall be greatest. He who is last shall be first. And that's the example of Tabitha. And the interesting thing here is that she knew something of God's plan. That's the great thing about the gospel. You know, all of the stories we looked at before are about people that were just doing things out of kindness. Well, now we know, don't we? We know how valuable and important it is to be kind. And she acted with some expectation of reward, because she believed in Jesus. She believed in the Son of God who died for her on the cross, and she was following his example because it was beautiful and lovely, and she admired it, and she wanted to be like her master. And she was brought back to life, but not just temporarily. And she is with her master now. Because she valued what the world does not value. In conclusion, brethren, there are these lessons not just for women. They're about women, godly women, good women, but they're lessons for us all. They're lessons for all who would be faithful, all who would learn the lesson of valuation of what really is important, and what really is dignified, and what really is admirable, and what really is beautiful, and what status really matters when this life is over with. And consider what will really matter in the end for all of us. And what will matter is that we have a heart that God values, that God respects and appreciates, because it's a heart like his. And that kindness is beautiful to him. That's the lesson of these women. Will we learn that lesson? Will we go out in the week to come and look for opportunities to perform small but oh so important acts of kindness for our brethren, for people around us? Not to bring any credit to ourselves, not to bring any status to ourselves, but to simply be children of God. I hope this will be of some help to you, to encourage you to do just that. If you're not a child of God, you need to be a disciple of Jesus like Tabitha was, and serve him. And the way that you begin that is by declaring your faith in Jesus, turning away from the world and the thoughts and viewpoints of the world and the behavior of the world, and start acting like Jesus. And to begin that by being baptized in his name. If you want to do that this morning, come and tell us as we stand and sing.